In 1993, America was given a choice between three candidates for president and was robbed of the right president. Instead, a saxophone-playing buffoon became president for 8 years during the 1990s. One man could have changed everything. The right man. What? Not Ross Perot. Read the title of the video. I am of course talking about the great George H.W. Bush. Bush was a foreign policy expert and was very needed during the 1990s when Russia was in a massive transitional phase as well as the rest of the world after the Cold War. One major problem with Bush's first term that we will change is the fact that Dan Quayle is vice president and was a complete idiot. Also, there was a recession and Bush raised taxes which made everyone mad, but we'll go with replacing the moron Dan Quayle. Bush could choose John McCain or Bob Dole for the previous 1988 election to help him with the 1992 election, as Quayle was one of the most idiotic vice presidents in American history. Or Bush drops Quayle in 92 and chooses Colin Powell, or it's more likely that he would need Ross Perot as his running mate to win the election. Each potential vice president has a different outcome in the 1992 election. It's debated how much Ross Perot impacted the election as he drew support from both Republicans and Democrats as well as moderates and independents who were going to vote for Clinton anyway. As Perot was a great candidate and enjoyed much popularity in the 1992 election, we'll select him to be Bush's running mate, and Bush will have to make some concessions to convince Perot to become his VP. The economy will rebound in Bush's second term, and Perot will do everything he can to shoot down NAFTA. This would result in NAFTA having lots of conditions about other countries meeting the same standards as the US, as it was bipartisan and is likely to still pass, but Perot would still be unhappy. And there are likely less border issues with illegal immigration due to work permits that were allowed under the Bush administration, which let migrants work in the US without becoming citizens. Aside from domestic issues and having a dumb vice president, another aspect of 1992 that we can change is if Saddam Hussein was overthrown as a result of the Gulf War. There were reasons that Bush did not overthrow Saddam during the Gulf War, as he felt that taking out Saddam would create a power vacuum in Iraq, and removing Saddam would benefit Iran. However, Iran had been devastated by the previous Iran-Iraq War, and U.S. intelligence on Iran during the Gulf War feared a renewed Iranian resolve in spreading the revolution into Iraq again. Additionally, during the Gulf War, the coalition was aimed at removing Iraq from Kuwait and not really Saddam from Iraq, and President Bush had called on the Iraqi military to overthrow Saddam. However, this message would be misinterpreted by the Iraqi people, who believed that American tanks would be rolling into Baghdad any day, and the uprisings were violently suppressed by the Ba'athist regime. In an alternate Gulf War, intelligence shows that Iran is in no position to expand, and the coalition agrees to remove Saddam right then and there. Saddam Hussein is toppled by either the coalition, Iraqi military, or Iraqi people, and Bush receives more credit for foreign policy successes, and because Saddam being removed from power in Desert Storm is seen as the climax of the war. Furthermore, wartime presidents are generally re-elected in American history, and the American people would not care as much about the increase in taxes if coalition forces are still fighting in Iraq against the Ba'athist regime. I will be doing a separate video on if the uprising succeeded against Saddam Hussein regardless of the US 1992 election, and that video will contain details of the uprisings and an alternate uprisings as well as an alternate coalition regime change in Iraq following the Gulf War and a detailed alternate history of Iraq in the 1990s and early 2000s. However, Bush could still win the 1992 election without Saddam being toppled, and if Saddam Hussein remained in power, Bush has a different approach compared to Clinton, whose sanctions were aimed at regime change and completely destroyed Iraq's societies in the 1990s and made the people reliant on Saddam Hussein remaining in power. I will go into further detail on this in my alternate uprisings video. Bush was more of a foreign policy realist, and if Saddam isn't toppled, then the US is not prioritizing regime change, assuming that the Gulf War had not already resulted in that outcome. The U.S. commits to no-fly zones and getting Saddam Hussein to comply with the UN instead of focusing on regime change within Iraq. This results in Saddam Hussein probably being toppled in the Arab Spring in 2011. Regardless of how things go down in Iraq, Bush would likely replace Cheney as Secretary of Defense due to conflict between the two. Bush and Cheney came to hate one another during H.W. Bush's administration, and if Cheney is not replaced, at least he would make sure that George W. Bush does not choose him as a running mate. Powell would then likely replace Cheney as Secretary of Defense during the Bush administration. On the world stage, let's start with how Bush would handle Somalia. It's possible that there's no Black Hawk Down incident in Somalia, as Bush and Clinton ran Somalia completely differently. Bush initiated Operation Restore Hope at the end of his presidency in our timeline and sent U.S. forces to be in a facilitation role and to prevent supplies from falling into warlord control. Clinton, however, wanted the U.S. to neutralize warlords after withdrawing the U.S. Marines. Under Bush, he continues the facilitation role, and it's possible that Restore Hope is at least more successful, which is important because it changes the viewpoint on humanitarian interventions, but Somalia would likely still have its own alternate issues which I won't get into in this video. There's a potential humanitarian mission in Rwanda to stop the genocide, and I couldn't predict the details of this intervention with the Bush administration and with a more successful Somalian intervention, but I do not think it goes well. Going to the breakup of Yugoslavia, Bush had been hesitant to support breakaway states in Yugoslavia as he did not want to involve U.S. troops in what he thought should have been a European affair for them to solve. However, with the siege of Sarajevo and the Bosnian War, Bush got the UN to give humanitarian aid to Bosnia and Herzegovina, but he still remained hesitant for U.S. involvement in 1992 as the Cold War was over. NATO was involved in the Bosnia War in a limited capacity under the Bush administration in the early 90s. Clinton, on the other hand, in our timeline, was outraged at the lack of U.S. intervention in the humanitarian crisis in the breakup of Yugoslavia and pressured U.S. allies to help American actions against the Serbs. Clinton also got NATO airstrikes to occur with Operation Deliberate Force in 1995, which brought the Serbs back to the negotiating table. Under Bush, I feel like NATO intervention would still happen in Yugoslavia, but it would be delayed and more reliant on non-US NATO states to do their part, at least initially, which would cause perhaps another year to go by before Operation Deliberate Force takes place. Bush knew how to get coalitions together and how to handle allies in military operations. So I believe that he would initially want the Europeans to handle Yugoslavia, and when Yugoslavic wars continue to see unprecedented death and destruction, the U.S. steps in to take the lead around 1994 and commits airstrikes and limited ground troops to Yugoslavia. NATO enlargement in the 90s would still take place, but Secretary of State James Baker warned of the consequences of enlarging NATO and how Russia would view it. Bush would take these warnings but still enlarge NATO as Clinton did. The difference is that the US and NATO would keep things more open with Russia in the 90s than the Clinton administration did. Turning back to the Middle East, Bush could possibly find a solution to the Arab-Israeli conflict. During the H.W. Bush administration, the U.S. had mediating getting Israel and the Arab world to be on the same side against Iraq during the Gulf War. He also took a more hostile approach to giving Israel aid as a result of Yitzhak Shamir's refusal to engage in the Madrid conference after the Gulf War and due to Shamir's pro-settlement policies. Furthermore, he was mad at Shamir when he was angry at the U.S. for giving jets to Saudi Arabia as a deterrent for future Iraqi attacks. Bush in the U.S. was seen as a solid mediator to the Palestinians during the Madrid conference, as Bush had been pretty much the only U.S. president to have challenged U.S. aid being given to Israel and being used for increased settlements in the West Bank. Madrid opened the door for the Oslo Accords despite having yielded very few results. Under Clinton, the Oslo Accords broke down for various reasons between Israel's Rabin and Palestine's Arafat, that I won't get into because of the length of this video right now, but there's a chance that Bush could have done a better job at mediating the two parties with his foreign policy successes and experience combined with his popularity in the Arab world. There's a lot I couldn't get into here about what would happen under the Bush administration compared to what did happen under the Clinton administration, but I won't because there's a lot to discuss regarding Israel's 90s domestic policies and leadership, as well as other things that were going on at the time. For Afghanistan, Bush would put pressure on Pakistan to stop supporting Hekmatyar and the Taliban with their bombardment of Kabul. You see, the ISI supplied both Hekmatyar and the Taliban with everything they needed to destroy Kabul and win the Afghan civil war from 1992 to 1996, which resulted in a Taliban victory, and another civil war from 96 to 2001, which ended with the U.S. invasion after 9/11. The U.S. gets Pakistan to stop supporting these groups in Afghanistan while the Northern Alliance and other groups take over their sections of Afghanistan, and it remains a warlord state but is relatively peaceful compared to what it became in our timeline. Like Israel-Palestine, there's so much to talk about regarding Afghanistan in the 90s that I don't have time to talk about in this video, as this video is predominantly about Bush becoming president instead of Clinton in the era from 1992 to 1996 and what he would have done differently. Another thing that Bush was very passionate about was removing biological and chemical weapons on the world stage, and he would likely increase these measures in the UN and other various international organizations. I don't have time to talk about how alternate US and Chinese relations would be in the 90s under the H.W. Bush administration because I'm not an expert in Chinese politics and I just really don't have the time to talk about it in this video. Back to the domestic U.S., it's possible that Ross Perot runs in 1996 with the Reform Party if he is not able to change the Republican Party from within during Bush's second term and if he can't get the nomination. Perot would run on domestic policies of the Reform Party with heavy anti-NAFTA rhetoric, but with some Republican foreign policies under the Bush administration with withdrawals from foreign affairs, but not as much as he had in our timeline, as he had been Bush's vice president for 4 years and understands more of why Bush did what he did on the foreign world. Democrats in 1996 would nominate potentially Al Gore, as he was on the 1992 Democratic ticket as vice president and performed well. Gore would likely win against Bob Dole or potentially Ross Perot, as he had presented himself as a centrist conservative Democrat when he had run in 1988. Gore would likely also win re-election in 2000 against George W. Bush. This would likely be a time in U.S. history where polarization becomes ranked up to 11. During Gore's time in office from January of 1997 to 2005, he continues Bush's policies on Yugoslavia and engages in the Kosovo War. 9/11 still happens and the US and NATO invade Afghanistan just like in our timeline. Iraq continues to undergo democratization under Gore's 2 terms and sees US foreign aid to Iraq as with the war on terror is ongoing. Iraq is dealing with some of its own insurgencies, especially as it's vulnerable in a transitional period between democracy and dictatorship. In Iraq, there are no massive sectarian violence without the Clinton sanctions, and insurgencies with militia groups and AQI are a lot smaller in this alternate timeline. ISIS would also not rise up in Iraq. John Kerry versus John McCain in 2004 could go either way, as Kerry had played a role in the popular alternate Gore administration, while McCain is the war on terror hawk who falls into the mainstream of 2004. I feel like McCain would barely win against Kerry in 2004, and 2008 would be unknown, as the housing market crash could not occur or occur later, as it was not run the same way it was under the Clinton administration. And considering that Perot was vice president and Gore had been president from 1997 to 2005, with that, I'll end the scenario. What do you think would have happened had George H.W. Bush won the 1992 election? How do you think it would have happened, and what do you think the results and lasting impacts on the world would be? Do you want me to make a part 2 where I expand on a lot of the topics that I barely scratched the surface of here? Let me know in the comments, and thank you for watching.